This coming July, Nelson Mandela will be 92 years old. From humble beginnings, his story is a truly remarkable one during a truly remarkable time in history that saw the end of apartheid in South Africa and saw him leading the country that had tried to keep him down for so long. My next guest, Martin Meredith, has written an autobiography of Nelson Mandela and joins me now on the phone. Martin, good evening.
Good evening.
Nelson was brought up to begin with rather what we would class as rather simple beginnings in a small village. What was his early life like?
Well, his daily life was very simple. In village life in South Africa in 1918, which was the year that he was born, really kind of consisted of herding cattle and milking goats and simple agricultural tasks. But he did have one significant advantage which changed his life, which was that he was a descendant of the Tembu royal family, although only from a minor branch of the royal family. But what that meant is that when his own father, who was a village chief, when his own father died, he was taken up by the paramount chief of the Tembu, and therefore he gained an education which was rare in those days. He went from primary school to secondary school, and then he gained a place at a university, the University of Fort Hare, which placed him in the elite, so the African elite, so that although his origins were humble, a simple village lad, he quickly made his way up the sort of ladder of education to become a member of the young African elite.
And it was whilst he was taken on by the Palace of the Regent, he was mixing with councillors and he was observing what was going on. Do you think that had quite a big influence on the man that he eventually became?
Yes, indeed it did. He observed in the background, as it were, the workings of the chiefly system and the way in which the chief operated, seeking a consensus. He was never trying to impose his views on his own councillors. His role was to listen to what the opinions of others, and then sometimes to, if you like, draw the meeting to a conclusion, perhaps deciding one way or the other on what to do. But it was this old procedure of the chiefs and the courts of the chiefs that made a huge impression on Mandela, and indeed throughout his political life he was always had this at the back of his mind as to how you draw people into a consensus rather than necessarily to lead from the front.
Because today we see Mandela as the mild-mannered elder statesman. Was he always like that? I mean, I read in your book that in many ways he was feared and revered in equal measure by some.
Yes. Well, as a youth, he was renowned for his rather impetuous behaviour. And indeed, he threw up his place at university more or less on a whim, which was an extraordinarily foolish thing to do, as he later recognised. And one of his great friends, Oliver Tambo, whom he started up a law firm, described him in those days, in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, as being passionate, emotional, sensitive, quickly stung to bitterness and retaliation by insult and patronage. And what you have there is a sort of an image of an intelligent but rather fiery young man. And indeed, some of his later actions place him in, or led him in that way into taking action which was rather precipitate. The interesting thing about his old age is that he still shows those signs sometimes of being, well, he did. He doesn't really anymore. But as president, could still be impetuous and stubborn.
And autocratic, I think you mentioned.
Certainly autocratic. And that's why, as you quoted me saying that he was feared as well as revered, he was noticeably autocratic in his dealings with his children and with those who are close to him. The curious thing about Mandela is that he's outwardly extremely friendly, but particularly with strangers. But with his intimates, he shows much less of the warmth that he does when he's with strangers. And his own children describe him as being a fairly kind of autocratic African father who really tried to kind of lay down the law as far as he saw it.
In a sense, the trouble for Mandela really started in the 60s when he helped co-found the ANC's armed wing, which he described as being done as a last resort. Was it surprising, as you've looked through his life, is it surprising that someone like Mandela took on an armed struggle?
No, I don't. It wasn't surprising in terms of his own personality. It was a serious misjudgment, and Mandela has made a number of serious misjudgments. That is that any attempt to take on the South African apartheid regime by military force, which is basically what he decided was necessary, was almost bound to fail. It was a very amateurish attempt, and it was Mandela's recklessness almost that led him to do this. But it's not surprising in terms of the way of his own character, that is it. He was always wanting to see action. And it's certainly the case that almost every action that he tried to take, legitimate action, that is political action, to try and confront the apartheid regime, was always thwarted. The South African apartheid regime had no inclination, had no hesitation in enforcing brutal repression, and all Mandela's attempts and those of his colleagues to seek a sort of a way through the political maelstrom always were clobbered. They got nowhere. But and that was the reason, Mandela argued, that violence or sabotage against the government was necessary. But it was a very bad mistake. It enabled the government, the apartheid government, to crush the ANC using the name of law and order. And Mandela and his colleagues were then kind of sentenced to life imprisonment, and the nationalist movement, of which he had been a leader of, just fell into disarray. It was silenced for more than 10 years, and the real point was, even at the time, it looked like a forlorn endeavor, and in retrospect, it was just a foolish attempt. But it wasn't surprising in terms of the man and his liking for action, for drama, for adventure, and he rather enjoyed that role of being the sort of the military hero.
Because the road to his imprisonment is quite complicated, I think. He was first arrested for leading workers to strike in 1961 and also for leaving the country illegally. And it was whilst he was in prison that he was then subsequently charged with plotting to overthrow the South African government, a charge which he denied. Did you believe him?
Oh, no. He during his trial, he fully admitted what he'd done. That is that he had recruited people for military training. He had organized attempts at sabotage. He had fully admitted that he was the founder of the military wing of the ANC. What he was careful to do was, if you like, not admit to anything that the government didn't have evidence about. But as to the central charges of that, was he involved in an attempt to overthrow South Africa's apartheid regime, he fully admitted that, against the advice of his own lawyers, it must be said, that his lawyers said if you admit that, they will hang you. The key point about his trial, where he was sentenced to life imprisonment, was not that a question of whether he was guilty or not, since he admitted guilt. It was really a question of whether he would be sentenced to death. And the trial really revolved around that issue rather than revolved around the question of his guilt or not.
Because they could have imprisoned them, they could have executed the whole lot of them. Do you think the government had cold feet?
No, it didn't really, oddly, have anything to do with the government itself. There was one single judge who oversaw the proceedings, the trial, who was an Afrikaner judge, but who had not been appointed by the apartheid government. He was a prior appointment. And although he was a rather irascible and eccentric character, he was not minded to be persuaded according to certainly the prosecutors. He was quite short-tempered with the prosecutors when they tried to lay on things that he clearly understood was... The prosecutors were trying to claim that was evidence for Mandela doing things that he certainly didn't do. And the judge was quite insistent that unless the prosecutors could provide evidence, he wasn't going to accept their case. So it wasn't that the government got cold feet. It was the judge made this crucial decision as to whether there should be a life sentence or whether there should be a death sentence. And it was finally balanced, but he himself, the judge, came to the decision that a life sentence was more warranted than a death sentence.